about this model because I thought it was really, really, really interesting, and I've been thinking for quite some time about the autistic personality, and it's really interesting to see that science has actually backed me out on this. Because I was thinking, oh, this makes sense. Maybe some of these people, like I've been talking about in previous videos about how I do feel like in some cases autism is like maybe overdiagnosed to people who don't really need diagnosis, such as people like Melanie Sykes, because they're not impaired. But nevertheless, these people might still have a high number of autistic traits. And I think I might have said in a previous video, I can't quite remember, that they might have an autistic personality, but I can't quite remember. But I have been thinking about this for quite some time, and this model definitely bears me out, so that's really cool. It's really great when you've thought something for yourself and then to have that backed out in the science. I'm like not even a scientist, but like I've just used my own power of reasoning to kind of deduce this, and then to kind of read about it as something actual real proper scientists are also talking about is really cool and made me quite excited and like thinking, wow, so there is merit in what I think sometimes then, you know, when I join up the dots and then you have it backed out by the science, it's pretty cool. I mean, I was aware of a border autism phenotype, so maybe in a way this autism personality thing is just another way of describing a border autism phenotype, which has been talked about before. So in some ways this isn't exactly new science. This has been talked about before, but maybe for the first time this is like bringing it together into some kind of coherent framework, which can then obviously guide research better. So that's very promising. So yeah, 100% agree with it. I think it does make a lot of sense, and I think the reason why I have a clinical diagnosis and my brother doesn't, and I do think my brother has the autistic personality, but he's not autistic. He's not autistic because he has enough social ability to get by in life, even though he is very socially awkward, and as a child he had really strong obsessions to the point of being like very, almost quite stereotypical, from an autistic perspective, which is quite funny. He memorised the whole train network, like literally the whole network, and he collected train tickets. He couldn't stand anything being out of order, so if he saw like a sign pointing the wrong way because someone had vandalised it, it actually made him feel really anxious and angry. He just hated it, so he actually had to go and rectify a sign. One time someone actually thought he was vandalising a sign, and a man shouted at him. My dad had to explain, no, he's not, he's actually rectifying the vandalism, he's actually restoring it how it was before, because he hated seeing vandalism. Anything vandalised he hated because he needed it, everything. I think it's this like sense of order and like not liking things being out of place. He is quite sensitive on a sensory level as well, so he definitely has quite a number of traits. And he had some speech difficulties as a young child. He actually saw a speech therapist because he struggled to pronounce certain words. He was never the most social of children, but unlike me, he would never meet the diagnostic criteria for autism because he's not disabled, he's not impaired, he functions really well. Yeah, I guess you could say he's a prime example of someone. I mean, in some ways, maybe we shouldn't even call it autistic, you know, because I think in some ways autism should only really be used for those with diagnosis. But I guess scientists use the word just because it guides research. So for want of a better description, an autistic personality, without actually being autistic, without actually being autistic in terms of actually being disabled and therefore meeting the clinical criteria. But he definitely has these broader phenotypic kind of characteristics, definitely. Yeah. I have quite a number of traits we share in common. I mean, he does get quite obsessed with things. So yeah, I would say broader phenotype autistic personality. I can see that in my brother, which is like suggests he carries some of the common genetic variants, luckily for him, without actually needing a diagnosis because he's not disabled. And I think the reason why I've got a diagnosis and he doesn't, I very strongly suspect I was exposed to risk factor, and that risk factor is when I stopped growing in a room. I've talked about this elsewhere. I stopped growing in the room, and I was born, very small. And I mean, I'm naturally small anyway, but like I shouldn't have been as small as what I was because I stopped growing in a room. And my mum thought that contributed to all of my problems. I do agree. I think that was a risk factor, and I think that these intrauterine events can push someone over the edge. So if that hadn't happened, I might have been like my brother. I would still have had an autistic personality, if you want to call it that, probably. Like, yeah, a bit more awkward than usual, a bit more obsessive than usual, but I don't think I would have been disabled. I think if that hadn't happened, it's probable that I would have... I think that's what pushed me over the edge and made my problems more extreme and therefore diagnosable. I mean, obviously I can't say for absolute certain, but I do think that is very likely as a proposition. I certainly think my extremely low non-verbal IQ was probably caused by that. The psychologist agreed, the one who assessed me. She said that, for example, she said those with intellectual disabilities often have those sort of events, and that's part of the reason why they have low IQs. Obviously, I've got a really high verbal IQ, but my non-verbal IQ is in the intellectually disabled range, even though I've got a really high verbal IQ. So, yeah, she said that could well explain it, the fact that I stopped growing in a womb, because non-verbal is most affected by incidents like that. The non-verbal, for example, spatial reasoning that part of the brain apparently is most susceptible to like adverse events. Yeah, it basically brain damage. So basically, yeah. Sorry, that's what it is. But yeah, so basically that is very likely. And that may well be why I've got the diagnosis and my brother doesn't, even though he definitely has traits. I see autistic personality traits in my dad. He's not autistic, but I can see traits. And lots of family members, I think particularly on my dad's side actually, because I think my dad's mum, she definitely had problems. I mean, she was a Holocaust survivor, so some of it is down to that, but she definitely had other things going on. She definitely did, and it wasn't just the Holocaust. She definitely had more going on there. And I do have a cousin on that side whose son has been diagnosed autistic, and I'm not surprised. I definitely think there's some genes going on there. Yeah, on my mum's side there are also a few cases. So probably genes on both sides, common genetic variants expressed in most family members, just as slight quirkiness and kind of maybe a bit more obsessiveness, and which is actually in most family members actually helped them in their careers or jobs and hasn't been a hindrance. This is why I agree with this model. So in my case, I think, yeah, what's pushed me over the edge is the fact that I have severe executive functioning problems, which I think has definitely been caused or contributed to by the fact I stopped growing in a womb. Yeah, caused by the fact I stopped growing in a womb. So executive functioning problems, low non-verbal IQ, and they've done research to show that low non-verbal IQ is one of the biggest indicators of how severe someone's autism is as well. Because obviously the non-verbal it does tap into executive functioning and social skills. So it doesn't matter how high your verbal IQ is, if your non-verbal is low, you're kind of screwed in most aspects of life that require socialisation, practical skills, all the things that enable you to get by in life, basically. Slow processing speeds as well. In a society, you expect people to be fast and quick. If you have slow processing speeds, yeah, it's not great. So I have these cognitive difficulties, which aren't part of the autistic personality. But if you do have them and you have the autistic personality because you've been exposed to these so basically, yeah, if you have an autistic personality, right, which obviously I do, if you have the autistic personality, an autistic personality in and of itself is not enough to meet the criteria for autism, okay? But if you have the autistic personality and you have been exposed to a risk factor, so in my case, stop growing in a womb, so you already have these common genetic variants that you might have more of in a particular family than in another family. So if there aren't these common genetic variants and you don't have abundance of them, you might be exposed to the same risk factors and not develop autism because you don't have these common genetic variants. It's kind of epigenetics in a way, or also to do with the way in which the interaction between genes and the environment. But you have to have these risk genes there in the first place, but in and of themselves they're not enough to give someone a diagnosis of autism. Because many people in the general population carry them without having this, with just maybe having some traits. So autistic personality exposed to risk factors that can then kind of mean that the person is less able to compensate for the autistic personality because they have lower executive functioning skills, or maybe lower non-verbal intelligence, or in very extreme cases someone might have like an all-round intellectual disability, you know, and yeah. But yeah, so, but I mean, any cognitive impairment can make a person basically more autistic, if you want to put it that way, because they don't have the ability to compensate so well. So it might just be as simple as a person having slight executive functioning problems, but the worse the executive functioning problems are, the harder it will be for the person to compensate for the autism. So these problems are not in and of themselves part of the autistic personality, in which is to say that if you just have a common genetic variance and have the autistic personality with the traits, so high detail focus, need for routine, a bit some difficulties in socialising, but otherwise because you have really, really good executive functioning skills, you're able to compensate enough for those difficulties to still be successful in life and not be impaired, then you don't need a diagnosis, basically. I think what's happening now is that a lot of these people who just have an autistic personality are getting diagnosed. I think that's what we're seeing. And I personally don't like that trend, because I think that autism should only be diagnosed to people who actually are clinically impaired, because otherwise it loses all meaning. But I do agree that this autistic personality does exist. And maybe we need a different name, because I suppose it is possible to have an autistic personality and still maybe face difficulties because of that, because even if you just have autistic traits and without being that impaired, those autistic traits in and of themselves might mean you do still face a greater level of difficulty in life, maybe from other people who don't understand and things like that. So maybe we just need to have like more understanding that these people are out there, and maybe create a different category for them, so that if they do need some support, they can have that explanation to help them understand themselves. But I think we need to reserve clinical autism for people who actually are really impaired, because otherwise it does lose all meaning. So yeah, people like Elon Musk, I think, have the autistic personality. I think people like Melanie Sykes, Christine McGuinness have the autistic personality. Yeah, because they have enough compensatory abilities not to be impaired, basically. Because if they were impaired, let's face it, they wouldn't be able to have got to where they are. Basically, let's face it. So yes. So I guess does suggest, though, as I've already said, that an autistic personality can confer strengths in a person. So when people say, so autism, clinical autism, is always a disability, a very serious disability, because the person has a cognitive deficit which overpowers their ability to make use of any strengths they might have. Obviously they still have strengths, but because it's a disability, it basically means it's going to be very hard for them to utilise their strengths, basically. At least not with loads and loads of support. But people who don't have those cognitive impairments and who just have the autistic personality might be able to be very, very, very successful, precisely because of their eye for detail, determination and intense focus. So they carry the genes. I just think, the common variant genes for autism without meeting the criteria, because they're not impaired. I do think there needs to be greater segmentation in the DSM. I think maybe these people might need an explanation for potential difficulties they face that might not be of a clinically impairing nature. But I think we should create a separate category for them, just to aid, just to make things easier to explain, because it can be difficult when you are clinically impaired to talk about autism, because it can mean so many different things. So I just feel we do need to have greater segmentation, which will enable better explanation. Okay, so thank you for watching.